Okay. Hello, quilters. So glad to have you with me as we make a quilt together. The quilt we're going to work on for the next several weeks is called the Urban Scandinavian Modern Half Square Triangle Quilt. And this pattern was created by Polly Carlson. And I've taken her pattern and personalized it a little bit. And so here is my version of her quilt. And you'll see some differences if you go online and see her quilt compared to mine. So what we need to do now is get started. The quilt is made of half square triangles, which means you have to start out with some squares. And one of the first things we have to do is cut those squares out. So I have a fat quarter laying right here on my table. And the first thing I want you to do is to understand that you can cut your squares out of a fat quarter. I am going to use 9.5-inch squares just for demonstration purposes. You're going to use either a 12.5-inch square or a 14.5-inch square or a 16.5-inch square. The size square you choose will determine the size of your quilt. If you choose a 16.5-inch square, you can make a king-size quilt. If you choose 14.5-inch square, you can make a quilt that will fit a standard bed. And the 12.5-inch squares will fit a twin bed. Everybody is going to cut 20 squares. So let's start cutting. I am using the lines on my cutting mat to help me to determine 9.5 inches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. And the reason I did that is because my ruler is not wide enough to measure 9.5. My ruler is only 6 inches wide, so the lines on my cutting board fill in very well for this purpose. I'm going to cut a strip then that is 9.5 inches wide. I'll get rid of the part that I don't need. And one other thing I need to say right here, in case some of you may have forgotten, when you're cutting, make sure the piece you're cutting off is under the ruler. Whether you're right-handed or left-handed, make sure what you're cutting off is under the ruler. That way, you don't distort it, and when you are through cutting, you can just get rid of the piece that you don't want. Okay, now I have one side of my 9.5-inch square. Now I need the next, I have two sides rather, now I need the last side of my 9.5-inch square. And so here we go again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then that's 9.5 right there. And I'm looking on my cutting mat to determine that 1/2 inch that I need to add to this. And here, this is the leftover. Here is my 9.5-inch square. And if I were going to continue this process, I would keep cutting because I can get one more 9.5-inch square out of this piece. This one I can't. But I'm going to put this aside for right now and show you how to cut from a piece of yardage. Here is some fabric that is typical quilter's fabric. It's approximately 42 inches wide. It's doubled over. You have to be aware of that. And once again, you want to do two things. You want to take the selvages off and you want to straighten it. And so let's do that right now. Please, please, please take all selvages off of your fabrics. Can't stress that enough. If I don't get you to do that, you're going to be very unhappy with me when you get ready to launder your quilt. Okay, now I can turn this around. Don't have to pick it up. I can turn this around. Selvages are gone. Now you can see I need to straighten this edge and this edge. And so now I can do that because I've got a nice straight cut here. And all I'm going to do is change the position of my fabric and put that straight cut across one of the horizontal lines on the cutting mat. And now I'm ready to get rid of this line that is a jagged cut. I probably used this for something else early on, and I pulled it out of my stash bin, and now I need to straighten it up so that I can use it again. Everybody has a stash bin. Some of us don't even know what's in the stash bin. We go through it every now and then to discover the treasures that are there. But nonetheless, we can get rid of that edge. Now, I've got a nice right angle here. I am going to cut a 9.5 inch strip from this piece of fabric so that I can make 9.5 inch squares. Once again, I'm going to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9.5. Now, when you're using yardage for this quilt, there can be quite a bit of fabric left over for future projects. I won't say waste fabric. I'll say fabric that you'll have in your stash, in your bin for future projects. But I have a 9.5 inch strip here. And before I start cutting squares from that, I'm going to get another 9.5 inch strip from another piece of fabric so that I can layer them and I don't have to cut all those squares separately. It's just a matter of managing your time and your effort and your resources so that you can accomplish something very efficiently. So let's say I'm going to use this orange. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not 9.5 inches. It's a little bit wider. I measured it earlier. So let's see how wide this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. Probably just a ½ inch too wide. And we need to get rid of that so that all of our squares are the same size, so that all of our blocks will work out to be the same size. Okay, here's the fun part. Let me get rid of this, give myself some room. When you're cutting, and those of you that have the handout will see this in the handout, you can layer strips of fabric on top of each other. You just want them to be nice and straight and even. And I'm going to do that with the blue and the orange that I just cut. It just makes it go a lot easier if you open the fabric out. You know it's folded. So if you open it out, make sure that your strips lay exactly one on top of the other. Then you can start cutting your squares. And I can get all of this out of the way. And yes, folks, I did do this when I was making this quilt. And I would encourage you to do the same thing. Now, I can just go through each of these, count my 9.5 measurement, and I'll cut 2 squares at a time. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. Using my guide here. 2 squares. And then we continue that process. And I like to pull my fabric up. That's a Vivian thing. If you don't need to pull it up, then don't worry about pulling it up. Just make sure you keep the 2 edges together. And you do have that little fold in the middle. Sometimes I press that out. I didn't do it this time, but if you feel like you want to press it out before you layer the 2 strips together, by all means, go ahead and press it so that you don't have it there and you don't have to deal with it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. Here we go. And we would continue this process until we would get as far as we could get using these 2 strips of fabric. And so I don't think you need to watch me cut that anymore, but you could have as many as 4 strips of fabric stacked together, especially if you have a nice sharp blade in your rotary cutter. And you do need to remember when to change the blade. If you are making cuts on your mat and the cuts stay there, that's because you have a dull blade in your cutter. These are self-healing mats, and they close up every time a sharp blade is used on them. But if the blade is dull, it makes a groove that is too wide for the mat to heal itself, and that's a clue. You want a nice smooth mat. You don't want to be able to run your finger over your mat and feel grooves. So that's an aside. Let's get on with our quilt. These squares that I just cut to make 2 of the blocks for a quilt. Remember, mine are 9.5 inches. They're smaller. They're just for demonstration purposes. Yours are going to be larger than this. You have 12.5, 14.5, or 16.5. And one of the first things you have to do, once you decide the colors you want to go together, etc., remember you must cut 20 squares. And some of your squares will be black and white. Some will be colors. You will sit down and decide, what color do I want to match with a black and white fabric? What colors do I want to match together? We're going to assume that I have sat down and made that decision, and I am going to put an orange square and a blue square together. Now the first thing I have to do is mark the squares. I have to mark a cutting line, and I have to mark 2 stitching lines. And for my purposes, I like just a regular old number 2 pencil. I can get a sharp point on it. I can make a narrow line. It doesn't matter that the pencil may not come out. No one's ever going to see it. It's on the wrong side of the fabric. And so we're going to just go ahead and use this pencil to mark this. Now, let me just back up a minute. When I cut these 2 squares out, they were right sides up. So one of them has to be turned so that it's right sides together. I'm going to take the one on the top, turn it over. Very difficult to determine the wrong side of this piece of fabric. But I want right sides together. I want them to match. And then I'm going to mark them so that I'll know where to cut and to sew. Using my ruler, I'm going to measure or mark from one corner diagonally to the other corner. And that's crucial. Can you get a close-up of this? Mm-hmm. Okay. That is crucial that we go from one corner to the other corner and we make a mark. Notice that your fabric tries to go a little bit ahead of you. Don't worry about it. Don't try to make one long straight line. Take it slowly. Get a line that you can see. It's crucial that you are able to see this line when you get ready to sew and to cut. This line is also crucial for marking the next 2 lines. And there's our line. Now I want to use my ruler and measure 1/4 of an inch on one side of that line. There is a 1/4 of an inch mark right there along the edge of the ruler. I want that 1/4 of an inch mark to lie directly on top of the line that I just drew. And so here we go. And this fabric is kind of dark and it's hard for you to see it, but I can see the line. Now I take my pencil and I draw a line, and this line that I'm drawing is 1/4 of an inch away from the first line that I drew. And there you are. You can see the first 2 lines. The one that ran from corner to corner on the diagonal, and then the second one that is 1/4 of an inch away. We have one more line to draw, and this time I'm going to take my ruler, but I'll use the other side to measure 1/4 of an inch this way from the diagonal line that I've drawn. And I do that by laying that 1/4 of an inch mark on the diagonal line. Take my pencil and slowly, see how that fabric wanted to move? You do want to be careful about that. And if it means drawing it in the other direction, by all means do that. There you see the 3 lines that I need. And to make sure my fabric doesn't move or go anywhere, I'm going to pin the 2 squares together. And there's no such thing as using too many pins. Please don't think that you can put too many pins in this, because you really can't. Okay, now we're going to the sewing machine, and I'll show you how to stitch that and how to cut it. Now that I'm at the sewing machine, before I stitch that, I have to give you some quick reminders. Number 1, we're starting a new project. There should be a new needle in your machine. Number 2, you should have bobbins already wound so that you don't run out of thread on a bobbin, have to stop in the middle of the project and rewind a bobbin. So you want bobbins already wound. You want to have a new needle in your sewing machine so that your sewing machine does not have to work overtime. If you ever do any research, you'll find out that many people will show you and tell you how hard a sewing machine works if a dull needle is in the machine. Okay, let's go. And as I stitch, I'm stitching on one of the lines away from the diagonal. And I want it to be as straight as possible. And so I'm just following along on that line. That's one of the reasons you want to make sure you draw the line dark enough so that you can just sew directly on that line, not beside it, not anywhere else, but on that line itself. And when I get to the end, we'll turn around and we will go on the next line. That's also why you want to have it pinned very well so that nothing shifts while you're stitching. Okay, we've sewn on our 2 stitching lines, and you can see that. Now we're going to cut on the diagonal lines. And you can do that either using scissors, the way I'm about to do it, or you can use your rotary cutter. I'm just more secure using my scissors. And there again, I want to stay on the line. I want both sides to have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And this is what happens. I think it's magic. I love the way this works out. Now I have one of my blocks, and I have an identical block to that. And so that's what you're going to do. You put 2 pieces of fabric together, you get 2 blocks. Okay. Now we need to talk about pressing these blocks. And before I get to the ironing board, I want to say something about this. Now that you have cut on the diagonal of your squares, this is a biased edge. And biased edges love to stretch. So you want to handle each of your triangles as little as possible. Because when you cut on the diagonal edge, you created a biased edge. And the biased edge has a lot of stretch. And the more you handle the triangles, the more it stretches. And one of your frustrations will be when you try to sew your blocks together, some may be distorted simply because there was too much handling of the triangles and the bias edge stretched. And then it's hard to sew those blocks together. So keep that in mind. Now, this is the way I would suggest you take them to the ironing board. Just leave them as they are, just like this. I'm going to turn my iron on, go to the ironing board, and show you how to press them. There are several schools of thought about pressing triangles. Some like to use steam. Some like to use something like this, magic sizing. And some will tell you don't use any kind of liquid, use a dry iron. I tend to use a little steam. And the first thing I want to do is lock my stitches into my fabric. And you do that by just pressing. Don't iron, don't go back and forth. Just steam that right down like that first. You have now set the stitches. And you want to press the seam allowance to the side, and you want it to go toward the darker fabric. Here's a little secret about that. The piece of fabric that you hold in your hand is the side to which the seam allowance will go. So if I want it to go toward that blue, which is darker, I hold the blue up and just press. Don't saw it, don't go back and forth. You're not ironing a shirt, you're not ironing a pair of slacks, you're just pressing. And once you get that pressed down, look at how neat your seam allowance is laying to the side. You don't have to press from the wrong side. You only need to press from the right side, and very little of that. Okay, let's get the second one done. Remember, secure your stitches, press, don't iron, press, and then you're now ready to press the seam allowance to the darker fabric. And remember, you press, you don't iron. And I can iron it over here now to make sure the whole block lays flat. There we are. You've got two of the blocks of your quilt. They are sewn, they are pressed. The last thing left to do is to cut these little dog ears off of each block. So I'm going to just get my scissors. Some are brave enough to do this with a rotary cutter. I'm not. I just use my little scissors and cut these dog ears off. And the way you want to do it is make sure your scissors lay beside that straight edge. And notice, folks, that diagonal line went from corner to corner. So does your seam allowance. If it's anywhere else, you might want to use your seam ripper to help you to get it to where it needs to be. I'm going to go back to the end of the table.
Okay.
Oh, you're filming?
Mm-hmm. Because these are just the in-between moments.
Well, I didn't realize that. But I'm going to go back to the end of the table so I can talk about these. Okay, you have now created half square triangles. And you've created blocks made of half square triangles. You're going to make 20 of these. You have cut 20 squares, which will give you 20 blocks. In each instance, you're going to get 2 of the same block. Your job for our next lesson will be to decide how you want to arrange your blocks to make your quilt. And I ask you to look at this for a moment. It's big, but you can see there are the half square triangles. And somewhere else in this quilt is this exact same block, the orange and the purple. Or here we've got green and a black. Or there is a blue and a black with white in it. 2 blocks that are the same. So when you begin to arrange your blocks, you decide whether you want those blocks that are alike to be near each other. Do you want them to be far away from each other? You decide exactly what you want. And when we get together again, you and I are going to work with the layout of your quilt that you have designed. I thank you for your attention for lesson 1, and I'll see you for lesson 2. Bye-bye.